Welcome, Johan, to your lecture on the national conflict resolution. Because we I took away 15 minutes, so Johan has an extra 15 minutes until 8, and then we have to leave. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you. And the title for this evening was decided long time ago, Rational Conflict Resolution, What Stands in the Way? Of course, I then have to mention some conflicts, more precisely 6, and they will be related to the things that have happened recently. Among the 6 is not Breivik. The reason for that is that it presupposes a kind of in-depth knowledge of Norwegian situations that will take quite a lot of time. So I'll mention to you the 6, so you have the table of content for what I'm going to say. Number 1, United States, Latin America. Number 2, Israel, Iran. Number 3, Israel, Arab states. Number 4, something about the Holocaust. Number 5, the possible coming wave of anti-Semitism in the United States. Number 6, debt bondage. And on the debt bondage, there are particularly 3 cases I want to explore. China versus United States. Germany versus Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Ireland. And the World Bank versus what used to be called the Third World. Now, in the course of saying something about these 6, I will implicitly say something about why things that I know are sensitive to Jews have been mentioned. I know it, but there are things that nevertheless have to be said. And I'll put them in a totally different context. I can give you one example. The word slavery is extremely sensitive to people in the southern United States, and also very sensitive to many Africans. Nevertheless, the word slavery occasionally has to be mentioned. So after that brief introduction, let me say a word about conflict. Conflict is a relation. It is not the property of one of the parties. It's a relation that has gone wrong. If you want to solve a conflict, put the relation straight. A marriage on the rocks is not necessarily only he or only she. It's the relation between them. Now, that doesn't mean that the attributes of her and him are irrelevant. They are irrelevant. But the key piece is the relationship. I could immediately go into what is called the sensitive topic. If you want to discuss the Holocaust, you have 2 narratives that are available. One is the horrible atrocities committed by the Germans, and another one is the suffering of the Jews. These 2 narratives are indispensable, but there is a third narrative. The relationship between Germans and Jews. Maybe you want to start in year 1506. Maybe you want to go back to 1400, 1200. Maybe you want to start after the First World War. You can start anywhere, but that narrative belongs to it. That does not mean that one is blaming the victim or blaming the perpetrator only. One is essentially blaming the relation between them. And the question then that arises is, what could have been done to that relation? So as you understand, I'm now in the midst of it. And I do not escape. I'm coming back to it. I'm just saying that I now take up United States, Latin America. There was a meeting in Cartagena in Colombia a couple of weeks ago. And it was a meeting of the Organization of American States. There were 33 countries present. It turned out to be 32 against 1. The one country alone was the United States. It was for the first time that the tension had crystallized to this point. If you go back, let us say 50 years, if you go back that much time, it was everybody against one country. The name of the country was Cuba. Today, United States has one ally left, Colombia. Also, Colombia turned against the United States. So let me put it, something seems to have gone wrong about the relation. What went wrong? Well, the 32 countries said it very clearly. We want two changes. We want Cuba reinserted as a member of the OAS, and we want decriminalization of drugs in order to try to get rid of the drug trade. And what for us is the most problematic aspect of the drug trade is not only the drugs, but the arms that are flowing from the United States into Latin America. Obama vetoed both of them. The meeting ended as a scandal. Now, Obama had good luck, because there was a sex scandal at the same time. I could use the expression, the sex scandal was used as a cover-up for the real scandal. In Washington Post, and I was living in the US when this happened, it was almost impossible to find out what had happened. Everything was about Hotel Cartagena and what happened. So now comes what I, of course, want to do. What's the solution? So I have 6 conflicts, and I'll treat you to what I see as the solution. I have lived many, many years in Latin America, I think I know it quite well. The solution is the following. Obama should have said yes. He should have said, give me 1 month, a couple of things I have to prepare. Make it time limited, have a review clause. Cuba is admitted on conditions of, let us call it good behavior. After 5 years, we insert the usual review clause that diplomats have. The decision that you want me to agree to will be reviewed. We make a trial with marijuana. I have been informed about the Portuguese case, where marijuana was not legalized. There was no change of law, but there was a change in the administrative procedures. There will be no prosecution in connection with marijuana. The experiences are all very positive, and the general sale of drugs has gone down immensely. Now, that is Portugal. It may work differently somewhere else. I think these are not bad solutions, but I add one thing that Obama could have said. I wish CELAC welcome. The Council of the States of Latin America and the Caribbean, Consejo de Estados Latinoamericanos y el Caribe. In that grouping, Canada and USA are not invited. And then he could have said, let us use OAS, the Organization of American States with headquarters in Washington, to discuss the relation between CELAC and North America on equitable terms. And if he were really good at it, you could have said, you are not now doing the same to Washington as we once did to London. You understand? It's a little bit emotional. I wish you welcome. Now, am I demanding too much? Well, then comes, of course, the next point. What stands in the way? Knowing Washington. Point 1 that stands in the way is the fear of looking weak. It's a very macho kind of thing. And looking strong is to be stern and hang on to what you have said. To yield is interpreted as weakness. Well, to that there is a saying in the Analects by Confucius. There is weakness in strength and strength in weakness. Mr. Obama, will you please look at the branch or a cherry blossom when the weight of snow becomes too heavy? You yield and the snow falls down. Second point, the United States is in a crisis. An enormous crisis, and that crisis has very many chapters to it. One is the economic crisis, which we all know. Another one is a social crisis, which is described by an author called Charles Murray. And the book is called Coming Apart. Coming Apart, White America. The whole thing coming apart. Obama is an intelligent man. He knows this. You could say there might be other things on his mind. I, of course, do not quite accept these two reasons. I would have a prediction. Imagine that Obama had said what I propose. Mr. Obama, Your Excellency, the world would embrace you. Latin America would embrace you. There would be a sigh of relief. You would regain so much of the love that is there for you and is now dwindling down the drain. I now turn immediately to Israel versus Iran. So you'll be treated to this kind of thing 6 times. You're through with number 1. Israel versus Iran. I think we know perfectly well what it is about. And the question is, of course, a possible war. Günter Grass took up this in a poem. I found this formulation, let us call it soft, nicely formulated. He got a storm of abuse heaped on him. Günter Grass, I think, can survive that. He has some training. What happened in Israel? The head of Mossad and the head of Shin Bet. So Mossad is the secret agency for the whole world. He does a lot of killing, spying on all of us. Might be present in this room tonight, in one form or the other. Shin Bet is the inner one, which is focused on not the world, but on the Arabs in Israel, including the, well, let us call it the Palestinian. What happens then is that the 2 heads of that one came out, they were both retired, and they said, roughly speaking, the following. They condemned the government's threat to start a war against Iran, some of them condemning the government's failure to negotiate with the Palestinians for peace. There was the hope that the current heads of the 2 organizations would be more positive to the government. They joined the condemnation. Then they were joined by a number of generals, some retired, some in service. And there was an indication that if the 2 civilians ahead of Israel today, Netanyahu and Barak, if they go ahead with this plan, there might be a military coup. We might simply refuse to do it. Now, the elections in 4 months. I would call this a crisis. There are some other elements of crisis. There are 2 books published. One, they're both in US and Israel. One book is called The Crisis of Zionism, and the other book is called Unmaking Israel. Unmaking Israel is about the inner concerns of Israel. The crisis of Zionism is about the contradiction between Orthodox Zionism and liberal Zionism. Liberal Zionism was behind the constitution, giving in principle equal rights to Jews and non-Jews. Orthodox Zionism, Arabs out. Quickly or slowly. That means Israel have a couple of problems, to put it mildly. Yuri Avneri says the following. How did Israel handle this? They did what Israelis almost always do when faced with serious problems or serious arguments. They don't get to grips with the matter itself, but select some minor detail and belabor it endlessly. Practically speaking, no one tried to disprove the assertions of the officers, neither concerning the proposed attack on Iran, nor concerning the nuclear issue. They focused on the speaker, not on what was said by Dagan from Mossad and Diskin from Shin Bet, that they are embittered because their terms of office were not extended, that they had felt humiliated. They are simply venting personal frustration, in other words, psychologizing. What had particularly Diskin said? Point one, if we attack them by war, we will not be able to eliminate their capacity, it's too deep down. If you want to speed up the purification of uranium ore, they will do it immediately. But there is a difference. If they do that, it will be with the acceptance of the whole world because of our attack. Now, these are heavy arguments. And they are heavy arguments that one has to go into. But my point is now not debate in Israel. My point is, what's the solution? So it's called solution orientation. And the solution is the following. A Middle East nuclear-free zone with Iran and Israel. 64% of Israelis are in favor, and Iran has said the same applies to us, we are in favor, provided Israel is in it. What stands in the way? If I should say what stands in the way, I could first say it is not easy to achieve a nuclear-free zone. Under whose auspices? Who will be the monitors? How about Pakistan? It's a part of West Asia, Central Asia, maybe not Middle East. But Ali Bhutto, the Minister of Energy in the 1970s, declared that the bomb that they were making was an Islamic bomb. And he mentioned, we have a right to the Islamic bomb, and the Protestants have an evangelical bomb, the Anglicans have an Anglican bomb, the Catholics, secularists have a Catholic bomb, the Orthodox have an Orthodox bomb, the Confucians have a Confucian bomb, the Jewish have a Hebrew bomb, and the Chinese have a Confucian bomb. We have a right to an Islamic bomb. In other words, it's sort of a civilizational response. I can say much more about that, I just leave it aside. That statement was taken very serious by Israel. So let's just say that they insist that Pakistan should be in it, and Pakistan would say, we are not going to do anything unless India is in it. India would say, we are not going to do anything unless United States, England, Russia, China, and France are in it. That's our condition. Then we are in difficult waters. You can say, negotiate particularly with Pakistan and make it for Israel, Iran. It is possible. But I'm not in any way saying that this is unproblematic. However, I'm not sure that's what stands in the way. What stands in the way is the Holocaust. It's the past. It's the idea of the imminent threat, surrounded by enemies. And if anybody has a reason to have that as an image of the past, it's the Jewish nation. The whole experience from Russia and the Russian Empire was to live in ghettos, small groups, surrounded by hostile people. And these hostile people would occasionally get at them and organize pogroms. Now, if you have experienced that many times, that shapes your worldview. You also have a role, the role of the Nazis and the Russians getting at you. And you look at Iran, you distort what Ahmadinejad has said, that is distorted. But you believe in the distortion, and you put them into the Nazi hole, the Nazi role. What do you do with that? Well, you have to clear up the past. That's not easy. I'm coming to some of it. To clear up the past, you have to enter the past. If you enter the past, you may have to say something that some people will feel sensitive about. I'll come to that. Right now I'm just saying. There's also maybe something else that stands in the way, and that may be power. We'll show Iran where the power is. Iran is uppity, we'll beat them. And we have a good friend on the other side of the Atlantic. And through our contact with US troops, we'll control them. So this is what Yuri Avneri writes in his article about it. So I'm just quoting him. Yuri Avneri is the senior peace activist in Israel. He's also a journalist, and I have a tendency to respect very much what he writes. But I noticed the degeneration of the debate. It's very far from one thing that I love about Judaism, the Talmudic dialogue. This idea with rabbi this and that saying that prophet this and that is to be understood the following way. Whereupon a rabbi 300 years later says he has misunderstood it completely. This is the way to understand it. Where is the final answer? There is no final answer. In the Bible and the Quran, there are a little bit too many final answers, to put it that way. There is a French expression for it, c'est trop placatif. I love the dialogue, and for me this is the explanation why Jews are fantastic intellectuals. What is intellectuality? Question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. How long does it go on? Forever. In the meantime, we professors get some salaries. Little bit, right? We are living very well, and if somebody comes up with a final answer, it would be a threat to us. So having said that, what I am saying is that we are deeply in it here. But I stand by what I have said, and I'll only like to add maybe one thing. If one could manage that nuclear-free zone, there is another one waiting to be born, the Korean Peninsula Free Zone. Maybe the Korean Peninsula Free Zone could be coupled to this one, or maybe they could take the two together. You see, sometimes it's better to take two together than only one. Because there's nobody saying just, why we? And you can do both of them. Now that requires leadership. It requires leadership. So having said that, I now go into Israel Arab states. So what do I say about that? Why don't I say Israel Palestine? I also say that, but you see, the conflict is not with Palestine only. It is with Arab states and it is with Islam. There are 22 Arab states, only one of them is Palestine. 350 million inhabitants. There are 56 Muslim states, 1,560 million inhabitants. Now, to take on all of that is a little bit much. It's a reductionism to say it is only with Palestine. And here I would then like to jump immediately to what I see as the solution. And some of you have heard me say it very often. The idea came when I was in 1971, visiting professor at the University of Cairo, a Middle East community. Now, Middle East community is MEC, MEC, and that sounds too similar to Mecca. So I have sometimes changed it to Eastern Mediterranean community, EMC, in order to avoid the Mecca fallacy. I have a 3-tier plan. At the bottom is an element of the two-state solution, Israel-Palestine. Open borders. I would say 2 capitals, one in West, one in East Jerusalem. Israel says no. I would say right of return for Jews and for Palestinians. I would add Arafat's statement about numbers we can discuss, but not about the right. It's an inalienable right. I've been talking with so many leading Palestinians about numbers we can discuss. Can you tell me something about the numbers? And I remember a Canadian who said, 2 Canadian Jews would be enough. Palestinians would be enough. It's the principle we're heading for. So we now add a little element. We put 2 Jewish cantons on the West Bank, and we put 2 Palestinian cantons in northwest Israel. We interconnect them. So this is, if you will, a 2-state solution. Then we add on top of that a 6-state solution. Israel with the 5 Arab neighbors. It is Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine recognized, and Egypt. Then we add on top of that an organization for security and cooperation in West Asia. Where is the inspiration? From Europe. May 1950, France, Germany, coal and steel union. 1st of January 1958, Treaty of Rome, the European Economic Community. Starting in 1990, blossoming in 1991, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. So we have sort of 3 tiers, these things on top of each other. Now, if you look at European history, there have been more fighting in Europe than in the Middle East. There have been a lot in the Middle East, but there have been more in Europe. Even more. Who brought this about? Well, if I should mention 2 names, it's 2 Frenchmen. Schumacher and Plevon. René Plevon. What did they say? Germany has been so atrocious that it has to become member of the family. People got angry, people laughed their asses off. Most ridiculous thing I've heard. Whereupon politicians stood up and said, it has always been my opinion that Germany has to be integrated into Europe. It was not always the opinion. I've been hoping for 2 Arab presidents to come out and say the same to Israel. I'm having my small feelers. No success. But when the plan was put forward in 1971, I had the guy who was 5 years older than me. He still is. And he was professor at the University of Cairo, and he said, the best plan I've seen so far. I'll translate it into Hebrew and Arabic. And his name was Boutros Boutros-Ghali. A very near friend. Have I had any success? Nothing. Well, I don't know. Plan is creeping up. You see, plans, what we mediators do is to sow seeds. So let me now criticize my own plan. I'm the best to do it. And I have, of course, been hearing arguments. But let me first point out one thing. If those 2 Frenchmen had only focused on Nazi atrocities, there would have been no plan. They said this has happened, but they want 1 step further. Fantastic. So it is this 1 step further which is the essential point. Israeli argument, we cannot admit them to come that close. They'll push us into the sea. And if they don't push us into the sea, they will outvote us. And if they don't outvote us, they will outvote us with their fertility rates. First line answers on my side. We don't vote, we have consensus. We don't accept anything where there's not agreement. But let's be practical and pragmatic about it. Let us say that you want to organize water supply. In a place where the water comes neither from Israel actually, nor from, well, it comes partly from Israel, but it doesn't come from Arab countries. It comes from Turkey. Tigris Euphrates. It comes from Ethiopia, the Nile, through African countries. There is an element of the Jordan and of the Litani River. It's very little. How do you get water? You have a parabolic mirror, you distill salt water, you concentrate the vapor, you put into it minerals to make it healthy for the human body, and you have it. You have one distillery plant at the border between Israel and Egypt, and you have one distillery plant between Israel and Gaza, let me put it this way, and you have one between Israel and Lebanon. You cooperate about it. You do this in a cooperative way. Don't look only at rivers, there are other sources of water, and if you look at the Mediterranean, it's quite big, you won't exhaust it easily. In other words, be pragmatic, be practical. Second line of defense on my side. The more pragmatic you are, and the more ability you have to show that this could succeed, the more friendship will you create. And please don't ask them to love you. And don't ask yourselves to love them. But you can deal with each other. And out of it, friendship will grow. Americans use the expression confidence-building measures. I don't like it so much. I find it a little bit cynical because it sounds like a sort of psychological operation. Some kind of Madison Avenue publicity thing. But there is something to it. You launch a cooperation for mutual benefit, and it has to be equitable. Now, how about the Arab side? What do they tell me? We are afraid of it. The Jews are immensely clever and powerful. They'll come in and take our own economy. They'll get under our skin and pervert the whole thing to their purposes. So I say, look at the history of the European community. In the beginning, the point was open border and free flow of goods and services, ideas and people. And you can say, settlement comes later. Investment comes later. But there is a warning in it. If you are a minority and you are an outsider, don't get in command of niches of some other country. You might get into trouble. And if you want a safe recipe for disaster, do that. Get in command of the economic and cultural niches, and you have a majority. What do they command? Military and the politics. Do I have examples? I certainly do. Armenians in Turkey. Tutsis relative to the Hutu in Rwanda. Jews in Germany. Chinese in Indonesia. Chinese in Malaysia. In 1965 there was genocide of Chinese in Indonesia. In 1966 the revolt exploded in Malaysia against Chinese. Fortunately the police and the military were able to quell it. And then they got the generational skilled politicians. One of them is called Mahathir. And they said, it's not Chinese out, it's Malays up. Not Chinese out, but Malays up. So that the Malays can come into these economic and cultural places. Where the Chinese in Penang and in the northern part of Malaysia have been so immensely clever, not in order to conquer anything, but just simply being clever at it, good at it. So instead of the negativism of ousting the Chinese and committing genocide, the positivism of lifting the Malays up. Well, this is called positive discrimination, and it worked. Chinese didn't necessarily like it, but they have adjusted to it. This is important. So we're now coming closer to the Holocaust. Let me say what would be good politics. Would have been through education, through employment, maybe in some cases positive economic discrimination, and enlightenment to lift the Germans up. But then I would of course immediately add, it was not only a question of relations between Germans and Jews. That was one point. It was the relation between Germans and the Allies, and that relation was expressed in the Versailles Treaty. Humiliation. At this point, you have to read Mein Kampf. And the fact that Mein Kampf is written by is not good enough argument not to read it. It's a good idea to know what you are rejecting. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for my violent approach. I apologize to the glass. And I'll see if I can lift the glass up. So, having said that, you see, Hitler's point was, this was not a war between peoples, it is a war between the royal houses. And the royal house of Germany abdicated after the capitulation. And we, the German people, are punished for the crimes of the royal houses. Now, that's a part of it. There were a couple of non-monarchic Germans participating in it. But it is an important part. A tremendous humiliation. And of course, Hitler's basic point was cancel the Versailles Treaty, to hell with it. Now, the search I have made makes it relatively clear to me that if in 1924, 5 years after the second Versailles Treaty, the first was in 1871, when the Germans had won, and the second one in 1919 has almost the same text. It's only Alsace-Lorraine is moving in the other direction, and so on. If in 1924, 5 years later, they had a review conference and had dumped it, I'm practically speaking certain that we would have saved Europe from the Second World War.
Can you repeat that sentence?
If we had dumped the Versailles Treaty, I'm practically speaking certain that we would have saved Europe from the Second World War. Hitler came into power through a relatively democratic vote. In March 1933, he did not grab power, he was given power by Hindenburg. There was a vote. If there had been monitors from the United Nations or whatever, I don't think it was worse than the United States in Florida in year 2000 or in Ohio in 2004, just to mention two cases. He won 52.5% together with his allied party. His major argument was the Versailles Treaty. Now, he also had, of course, employment. But this was before he started Keynesianism, which he did. Does that mean that John Maynard Keynes was a Nazi? No. It doesn't mean. It does mean that I put at the disposal a formula for aiding and ailing capitalist economy by contra-conjuncture moves financed by the state. I can then say much more about it, but I have said the basic point. Now add to this a positive formula lifting Germans up, the Mahathir approach. And I think definitely we would have been saved. Why didn't that happen? What stood in the way? What stood in the way was to a large extent Allied powers' arrogance. We are one, we dictate the terms. And that was Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Woodrow Wilson. But Woodrow Wilson did a lot of good work with self-determination. I could of course add as a little footnote that there was a young colored man with so-called yellow skin who came to the US Embassy. He was studying in Paris. And he came with a plea because Woodrow Wilson was visiting. Could you please also apply self-determination to my country? His name was Ho Chi Minh. And he was chased away by the US Marines. Because it was very clear that this was for white people and not for colored people. Now, that made some impression on Ho Chi Minh, you can imagine. It's called a trauma. So, having said that, it's important to contemplate the past. And will nobody please say, distribute anti-Semite certificates, because I am pointing to a factor that was used by the Nazis. I am pointing to that factor, and it was used by the Nazis. I could of course say that if the Nazis say that 2 + 2 = 4, then I do not reject that. But my task is to understand the past. And the theory that is behind that is something called rank discordance. Let us say that you have 4 types of power in society: economic, cultural, military, political. And somebody is high economic, cultural, military, political, and somebody is low. Somebody is powerful, somebody is powerless. You have a feudal society. It's a horrible society. Then you have another society where somebody is high economic, culturally, and the other one is high military, political. And you have a recipe for disaster. This is called rank concordance. This is called rank discordance. So this is a sociological point of view. The only objection I have to the press report, I was called a sociologist. Would you please change it to mathematician and sociologist? I have a PhD in both of them. Would you please be so kind to change it and not twist my degrees? So, having said that, let me move on. I have now uttered a couple of things, and I now come to a very key point. And the key point is a prognosis. I'm now connecting the US part to the Israeli part. I have as a background the Holocaust, a tremendous anti-Semitism, a horrible atrocity. And I'm in absolutely no way justifying what the Nazis did. I'm just trying to explain it. So will you please keep the 2 vocabularies, justification and explanation, apart? They belong to different pockets in philosophy. If you don't like what happened, will you please think of explaining it and remove the cause? So I'm now going into the future. I'm assuming that US goes further down. What do I mean by that? Falling socially more apart. The gap between the 1% and the 99% broadening. And the Occupy movement have made all of us a favor by putting its finger on the vocabulary 99 versus 1. They have already won some of the discourse battle. That's important. It broadens. There is nothing efficient being done to lift up the poor. There is nothing efficient being done to stop the flow of money into the pockets of the richest. Let us then say that the dollar decreases in value and that there are other currencies, mixed currencies, taken over gradually as world currency. It loses its status as world reserve currency because it cannot be trusted. Let us say that the society then is in a social crisis and in an economic crisis. They have lost the Latin American elites. Let us say that they gradually start losing some European elites. They will hang on to some of the Eastern European. And the last one they will lose is the Georgian leadership. So hang on to that one. Now, they have lost a lot in Asia. They're losing the Muslim countries. The G7 countries around the Gulf are very much in ambiguity. They're reading the handwriting on the wall. And now comes the problem. The American people want to understand what happened. Well, there is something called scapegoating. And you know whom they will select. I'm terribly afraid of it. I'm terribly afraid of a storm of anti-Semitism. It is latent in the US. It has been silent by the vocabulary of Judeo-Christianity, by, very importantly, Christian Zionism, by the cooperation between evangelicals and Jewish Zionists. All of that has, if you will, put a gloss on it at the top. It's a very important one. I'm in no way lashing out against it. I'm only saying that with my knowledge of the US, this is not deep. It takes only one demagogue on the US people's side to change it. Solution. US mainstream media, will you please open up? Will you please permit debate about all these issues? And in that case, you may have to mention a couple of critical points about Israel. And if somebody mentions a couple of critical points about Israel and happens to be a US congressman, please don't start churning out anti-Semitism certificates. You're quite generous about that. Mm-hmm. Quite generous. Now, I know a US senator who is the only one who didn't submit. He lost the election. And he said publicly that all my colleagues, there are 435 congressmen and 100 senators, 535 altogether, are scared to death by churning out those certificates. US media, are you aware you're destroying democracy? Democracy is based on freedom of expression and not on threats. And if somebody has a point you don't like, publish it nonetheless, and then come up with the arguments against it. Pro et contra dicere, saying for and against. That's the nature of democracy. And you can learn from one Israeli paper. So let me put it this, generally speaking, Haaretz does this. If you want to see the way they treated me, you can compare, and anybody can get it if you want it, what I said and how they twisted it. And I have been, for 1 week or something, the world #1 anti-Semite. I'm not the slightest anti-Semitic. And I find that the label is libel. But I'm not a sworn philo-Semite. I don't like such labels. I prefer to take up as the issues that they are and reserve my analytical, sorry for the expression, talent to get at it, and then my freedom of expression to say what I see. And I serve nobody by not reporting what I see. And that's what I have done right now. I'm afraid of it. The last one, debt bondage. I did mention the protocols. Well knowing what it means. I accept fully, unreservedly, completely that it was a conspiracy by the Russian secret police, as has been proven again and again. So since that has been proven, there is of course no danger in reading it. I have a problem. I would like to know who did it. Because if you read it, it's a quite clever economic analysis of how to get people into bondage. It's a recipe for how you do it. And I share the view of somebody who says, I don't think the average Russian secret police, Okhrana, had people with that economic insight. Probably they took it from a Frenchman who had that economic insight and who wrote a very gifted play which was a discussion between Satan and Montesquieu. I mean, already to have the idea of organizing a dialogue between Montesquieu and the devil. It's already quite something. Now, it's not so interesting who did it. That's only curiosity. The interesting thing is the beginning of the protocols. You have to start by making the working classes believe that they can improve their situation by claiming higher salaries through strike. When you do that, the companies either shut down or they have to give them something. Some companies do it, some companies don't do it. Some companies get into debt, some of them get bankrupt. The workers chalk down one victory, they go on. Some companies will go into real difficulty. They have to be helped by the government. Some of the governments get into difficulties. They have to be helped by somebody high up. Where do I find this in the world today? I find it 3 places. The United States versus China versus United States. China together with Japan and EU. But Japan and EU are secondary because they're so indebted themselves. China is the net creditor. US is the biggest debtor in the world. Number 2 is Spain. Now, second case, Germany relative to Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Ireland. GIPSI, the so-called gypsy countries. Nothing to do with the Roma people, but it happens to be the periphery of Europe. You suddenly have the center in the Europe putting the periphery of Europe in debt bondage. The World Bank relative to what used to be called the Third World. And if you want to read a test case, John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I'll not recite this argument. I've given references now to a couple of books. But if you want to read it, it makes you shiver. It was the World Bank and Washington against Ecuador, helped by the oil industry in Texas. And at that point, you can guess who. But what I'm saying now, not the wildest anti-Semite will put together China, the next one Germany, and then Texas oil industry and see that as a Jewish plot. You see? The point is that debt bondage transcends any debate about the role of Jews in the world economy. Solution. Germany, debt forgiveness. How quickly, one can discuss. So you can write it down to 0 over 5 years, over 10 years, over 2 years. It's in your own interest. You can afford it. You have already gotten the Greek reaction. They paint swastikas on the photos of all of your leaders. They look at the last time you traumatized them, and that was the Nazi German invasion. And they do exactly the thing that we know. You take today's trauma and put it into yesterday's trauma. Or you let yesterday's trauma come back and configure the way you think about today's trauma. Now, this is very human. We can do things about it. We could try to handle yesterday's trauma, or we can make people aware that this is what happened. But dear, dear, dear Germany, it's in your interest to do it. And I'll tell you one more thing which is in your interest. Not to talk about so much about bailouts of banks, where you first bail them out for the interest they're paying to you. And then you give them a new loan so that they pay higher interest to you in order to service the first interest. This is wrong. And they know it all. Much more interesting would be if you could help them with stimulus, lifting the bottom up. And gypsy countries, start trading among yourselves. Less with the center of Europe. Trade among yourselves. Have savings banks. Let 10,000 small savings banks grow in the countryside in the 6 countries. 5 countries, GIPSI. And here I then have a long list of things to propose. And I could say to Germany, this would all be in your interest. And I could say to European community, it would certainly be in your interest. The threat to the European Union or the European community is partly a single currency with no treasury, as George Soros points out, and has pointed out for years. He knows something about it, being one of the key speculators in the world. And he's extremely clever. He speculates, gets a lot of money, and then writes a book of how bad speculation is. So it's really getting it both ways. So, having said that, the point now is the following. The European community cannot take this debt bondage gradient in its midst community spells communality. It cannot take that. Continue with your debt bondage, Germany, and you are destroying a child that was partly of your making. China. Debt forgiveness relative to US. Help the US lifting the bottom up. The US is bad at doing it, you are damn good at it. You lifted 400 million up from the bottom from 1991 to 2004. 400 million according to the World Bank. Share the tricks with them. They may call it communism, but some sensible people will just simply do it. Share that with them. Now, you have a right to say, could I have a look at your budget? Because you may cut down some points. And you may have a right to say that I find your Pentagon budget a little bit high. Would you please be so kind to cut down that one 50%? And then Washington says, how about you? I find that one bloated too. Then China says, it's bloated because you are bloated. On the contrary, we may be a little bit high because you are high. Okay, let's sit down and have negotiation. So let us combine cutting the Pentagon budget with disarmament talks. Let's combine it. What do you need for that? You need leadership. Do we have leadership? Hu Jintao is the kind of guy who could do it. I have very great respect for that man. He is now fizzling out. Because they have now a transfer of power, and for the first time they're getting people into a power who are not appointed by the great guy who got China moving in 1980, after Mao Zedong died in 1976. So, having said that, we need leadership. What stands in the way? On the US side, ideology. Free market. Do it interfere with free market? You would lift people up who have not worked for the lifting up money. Some of that money will come from people higher up. You will do what the American conservatives call socialism, taking money out of my pocket to keep it in that lazy guy's pocket, called socialism. Now there is something to it. It's not the method I recommend. The method I recommend is microcredit to small companies at the bottom so that they produce what they need for basic needs, lifting them up, give them acquisitive power by selling their products, and they will join the capitalist economy. But you need to help them to start with. So having said that, what more stands in the way? I could say lack of eclecticism on the American side. The Chinese have a term called capicommunism. So communism means satisfying basic needs. And you may have to subsidize it. Capitalism means going to the supermarket. It means demand and supply. It's done by means of money. In order for them, they have to have money. In order for them to get money, you have to help them up. So communism is the basic needs part, and capitalism is the supermarket part. Can American minds tolerate the vocabulary capicommunism? Or is it to demand too much? Well, I'll give you the answer. The American mind, for the bottom 90% of the society, can take it. You don't necessarily have to call it capicommunism. But lifting people at the bottom up, they can take it. Maybe they will have to do it without Washington and without Congress. Maybe the Congress politicians still are bought for some time. So at that point, I have reached very close to my limit. And I'll just say that I have done this, and I have mentioned some sensitive things. But I try to put them to good use. So here I am, and I just thank you for your patience.